Hey everyone, welcome back. If I told you that between mid-March and April this year, the very fabric of our built environment got incredibly dynamic, you might wonder what I mean.
Yeah, it's been a really active period. We've seen all sorts of forces from major elections to maybe even subtle spiritual shifts really impacting the places we live and work.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today. We're going to dissect 5 key shifts, all captured in some really insightful infographics to understand this moment better.
That's right. We're looking at how these big headline events actually shape our physical surroundings, our communities.
So quick roadmap for you. First up, the housing crisis debate heating up in Canada's 2025 elections, comparing Pierre Poilievre, Mark Carney, and the current government's plans.
Then we'll tackle the shockwaves from Trump's newly announced reciprocal tariffs on global trade. Huge potential impact there.
And we'll dig into the formula behind those tariffs, how they might actually change the cost, and even the materials used in building homes.
After that, a fascinating story. Professor Jason Stanley moving from Yale to Canada. We'll use, believe it or not, the price of eggs to compare the cost of living.
A quirky but telling indicator. And finally, we'll discuss the passing of Pope Francis and the significant transformations happening within the Catholic Church.
Yeah, things like declining baptisms in Latin America and how church properties are being repurposed, for instance, in Montreal.
The key thing here, as you said, is understanding how these large-scale events connect directly to the places around us. It's not just abstract news.
Absolutely. It's about the real-world consequences for our built environment.
Okay, let's start with Canada and that housing crisis.
hmm
The big question, looking at the plans from Poilievre, Carney, and the current government is, are these genuinely different solutions, or is it more like policy convergence, different paths to maybe the same place?
That's the core question, isn't it? If you look at the specific targets, well, Polyev talks about a 15% annual increase in housing completions. He's proposing financial penalties and rewards for cities to hit those numbers.
Okay, a stick and carrot approach. What about Carney?
Carney's proposing 4 million homes over 10 years. He's really emphasizing innovation and bringing in private capital to help achieve that.
And the current government, they have their own target too, right?
Yes, they're aiming for 5.8 million homes by 2030, with a focus on incentives for rental housing and public housing initiatives.
So different numbers, different time frames. What about making things cheaper? How do their cost reduction strategies compare?
Also distinct, at least on the surface. Poilievre wants to remove the GST, that's the goods and services tax, on new rental projects that are specifically below market value.
Okay, targeting affordability in rentals.
Right. Carney, on the other hand, suggests removing the GST for first-time homebuyers, but only on properties under $1 million.
Doing focus group there. And the current government.
They've already expanded the GST exemption for new rental apartments and also for student residences. So some overlap, but different scopes.
Interesting. Now, what about using federal land? That always comes up.
It does. Poilievre's plan involves converting 15% of the roughly 37,000 federal buildings into housing units.
That's a specific number. Sounds
Yeah.
ambitious.
It is. Carney's approach seems broader, expanding infrastructure investments that are specifically focused on supporting housing development, more enabling, perhaps.
And the current government has its public lands for homes plan, right? Unlocking underused government land.
Exactly. Again, different mechanisms aiming for a similar outcome. More land available for building.
So when it comes to actual affordability and accessibility, how do they stack up?
Poilievre emphasizes cutting costs and speeding up approvals, but his plan doesn't explicitly mention fixed affordability targets.
More focus on supply and process efficiency, maybe.
Seems like it. Carney, however, commits to at least 30% of new builds being affordable housing. He also specifically mentions support for co-op housing.
That's a clear target, and the current government's angle.
They've put money into an affordable housing fund, $1 billion, plus there's a new Canada Rental Protection Fund, and a push for expanding non-market housing options.
So when you lay it all out, you see these apparent contradictions, but also overlaps, like Poilievre, a conservative, proposing pretty direct federal intervention with penalties.
Right, while the Liberals under Carney are leaning heavily on private capital. It does make you question how neatly the traditional left-right ideological lines apply here, doesn't it?
It really does. Are we seeing fundamentally opposed ideologies or just different strategies, different execution plans for tackling the same massive problem?
It's something for you, the listener, to really think about. Are these truly distinct political visions for housing or variations on a theme driven by the urgency of the crisis?
Okay, let's shift gears dramatically now. Let's talk about what's being called Trump's tariff earthquake. He recently announced these reciprocal tariffs, and the term earthquake feels apt.
It's a powerful analogy. It highlights the potential for massive disruption. And it makes an interesting comparison, actually, to a real geological event this year, the tragic 7.7 magnitude earthquake in Myanmar.
Ah, right. That resulted in over 4,000 deaths, sadly. A terrible reminder of natural forces.
Exactly. And both kinds of events, economic earthquakes and literal ones, expose societal vulnerabilities, don't they? The Myanmar quake really underscores the critical importance of things like building codes and infrastructure resilience.
And there's a strange irony, isn't there? Myanmar, along with other Asian nations, often described as having cheap labor who built their economies on trade.
Now face a potential 44% U.S. tariff under this new proposal. It's a stark shift.
And it's not just them. The impact is wide-reaching, hitting countries across Asia, Europe, and beyond.
Absolutely. It's a global ripple effect.
To maybe help us grasp the dynamics here, you suggested thinking about some classic stories, The Three Little Pigs and The Boy Who Cried Wolf.
Yeah, bear with me. It might sound a bit simplistic, but think about the three little pigs. Different countries have built their trade relationships with the U.S. using different materials, metaphorically speaking.
Okay, like some built with strong bricks, maybe diverse exports, strong domestic markets, while others used more fragile straw or sticks, perhaps over-reliance on one sector or cheap exports.
Exactly. And now Trump's proposed reciprocal tariff acts like the big bad wolf, testing the resilience of these different economic structures. We'll see which houses can withstand the huffing and puffing of tariffs.
I like that. Okay, and The Boy Who Cried Wolf, how does that fit?
Well, there were years of threats, right? Talk of trade wars, tariff hikes. After a while, maybe some countries became skeptical, thinking the wolf wouldn't actually come.
Until it did. Until the tariffs were actually announced and set to be implemented. Trump even called the day of the announcement Liberation Day, didn't he?
He did. So the story reflects that growing skepticism followed by the sudden reality of the situation.
It's fascinating how these simple stories can illuminate complex economic dynamics. But let's bring it right back home. How do these tariffs, this earthquake, tangibly affect, say, the listener's own house?
That's the crucial link. It's not just abstract foreign trade. According to estimates, roughly 7% of all materials used in new residential construction in the U.S. are imported.
7%. That sounds significant when you think about everything that goes into a house.
It is. We're talking steel, aluminum, lumber, drywall, fixtures, flooring, roofing materials, all sorts of things. And tariffs on these imported goods inevitably push up construction costs.
So who are the main suppliers of these imported construction materials to the U.S.? Where is this stuff coming from?
China is the biggest source, accounting for about 27% of those imported materials.
Wow, over a quarter.
Yeah. Then you have Mexico at around 11% and Canada at 8%. After that, several other key players like Vietnam, Taiwan, Japan, India, South Korea, and Thailand each contribute between 3% and 5%.
And European countries?
Germany plays a notable role too. And then all other countries combined make up the remaining 27%. It's a diverse supply chain.
So the takeaway is clear. These tariffs aren't just some distant negotiation. They directly influence the cost and potentially even the availability of the materials used to build or renovate our homes.
Precisely. It hits close to home, literally.
All right, let's move to another story about crossing borders, but for very different reasons. The case of Yale professor Jason Stanley, who moved to Canada on March 28th this year.
Right. He cited political reasons, expressing concerns about what he termed rising fascism in the U.S., and feeling he'd be better positioned to, quote, fight bullies from Canada.
Serious motivations. But his move also brings up a more everyday aspect of choosing between countries, the simple cost of living. And the infographic we saw used a surprisingly basic item as an indicator.
The price of a dozen eggs? It sounds trivial, maybe, but the infographic included a ranking showing how the cost of this staple, and by extension, maybe breakfast, varies significantly.
It's a way to make cost of living tangible, I suppose.
Exactly. It encourages you to think about how these seemingly small economic indicators, the price of eggs, milk, bread, can actually reflect much larger societal and economic trends, like agricultural policies, supply chain efficiency, inflation.
So Stanley's personal political decision inadvertently shines a light on these broader economic comparisons.
In a very relatable way, yes. It's a simple metric that can hint at more complex underlying economic structures.
Okay, for our final topic, we turn to a major event in the religious world, the passing of Pope Francis.
Yes, a significant moment. And beyond reflecting on his papacy, his passing provides a moment to consider the profound transformations happening within the Catholic Church today.
One key trend highlighted in the data we looked at is the global decline in baptisms,
That's right, it's a consistent trend worldwide, but it's particularly striking when you focus on Latin America.
which is home to the largest share of the world's Catholics, isn't it?
Correct. And in Latin America, the data shows a really strong correlation between the drop in baptisms and a sharp decline in fertility rates over the past couple of decades.
What kind of numbers are we talking about?
Between 1998 and 2024, baptisms in Latin America fell from about 17.9 million down to 13 million. Over roughly the same period, the average fertility rate dropped from 2.74 children per woman to just 1.78.
Wow, that's a steep drop in fertility.
It is, and the statistical correlation between those two trends is incredibly high, over zero point 0.9. It suggests these demographic shifts are deeply intertwined.
And these aren't just numbers, are they? They reflect deeper cultural and societal changes.
Absolutely. Changes in family structures, potentially shifting values, maybe secularization trends. It all impacts how communities live, gather, and express their beliefs. And it has implications for the church's physical presence, too.
Which leads to the issue of unused church buildings, particularly in the global north.
Exactly. As congregations shrink or demographics shift, many dioceses are finding themselves with underutilized, sometimes empty, parish buildings. It's a growing challenge.
But Montreal seems to be tackling this proactively.
Yes, it's a really interesting case. The Archdiocese of Montreal has actually set up a nonprofit real estate arm specifically to repurpose church properties for social good.
So instead of just selling them off, they're finding new uses.
Right. Things like converting them into affordable housing, shelters, community centers. They have over 180 parishes, many in central, valuable locations, so the potential is significant.
It's a way of preserving the community value of these spaces, even if their original religious function is diminishing.
Precisely. It acknowledges their historical significance while adapting to current social needs. And given the ongoing demographic and cultural trends, this Montreal model might become increasingly relevant in other parts of the world, too.
So as we've seen across all these examples, our built environment, our homes, cities, even repurposed churches is far more than just physical structures.
It truly is a dynamic reflection of everything else happening: our politics, our economies, our collective beliefs, anxieties, and aspirations.
From a Canadian election promise shaping housing supply to a U.S. tariff potentially changing the cost of your kitchen renovation.
To a professor choosing a country based partly on the price of eggs. Or a church finding new life as affordable housing.
It all shows how interconnected these seemingly separate spheres are in shaping the places we inhabit.
It can feel overwhelming, all these big forces at play, but understanding these connections through data, through stories like these.
That's where the power lies, doesn't it? Understanding gives us context and maybe even some agency to think critically about the future we're building.
Well said. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive today.
And we'll leave you with this thought. Looking at your own community, which of these forces, political promises, economic shifts like tariffs, demographic changes, personal choices driven by cost or values, which do you think might have the most immediate and profound impact on your built environment in the near future, and why? Something to observe and consider. Thanks for listening.